In 2017, a man in the US received a phone call from an unknown number late one night. The caller's voice was strangely distorted, and the man could barely make out the words. The person on the other end repeatedly asked, "Can you hear me?" At first, the man thought it was a wrong number or a prank call. However, the voice started to sound more distorted and intense as the conversation went on. The man hung up, but the calls kept coming, and each time, the voice seemed to get closer and more aggressive. After several calls, he disconnected his phone and blocked the number. Many people believe this was part of a scam where callers try to get the victim to say yes, so they can record it and use the recording to steal personal information or make fraudulent charges. However, the tone of the call seemed unusual for a typical scam, leaving the man deeply disturbed. A woman living in Ohio began receiving silent phone calls starting in 2003. Initially, she thought the calls were just a telemarketer with a bad connection. However, after receiving numerous calls at all hours of the day, things began to take a darker turn. During a call, the woman noticed faint breathing on the other end of the line. The breathing became more pronounced and seemed to be closer, as though someone was standing just behind her. She reported the incident to the authorities, who were unable to trace the calls. It wasn't until weeks later, after a neighbor was found dead, in what appeared to be a botched robbery attempt, that she wondered whether the calls had been connected. The calls stopped soon after. The police were never able to determine who made them, but they left the woman feeling uneasy, especially with the terrifying coincidence involving her neighbor's death. In 2010, a woman received an unexpected call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, the voice on the other end was eerily familiar. It knew things about her past, things no stranger could know. The voice mentioned friends from her childhood, places she had lived, and even the name of her old pet, all of which seemed completely random. At first, the woman thought it was a wrong number, or someone playing a cruel joke, but the details were too specific. She asked the caller who they were, but they simply repeated, "I know you." The woman immediately hung up and blocked the number, but the calls persisted. On the fourth call, the voice said, "I've been watching you," and began referencing her new job, relationships, and other personal details. She eventually traced the calls back to an old acquaintance, someone she hadn't seen in years, who had been stalking her online. Once the police intervened, the calls stopped, but the woman was left terrified at how this person had gathered so much information. In 2004, a man in California received a strange phone call in the middle of the night. The call began with only static and muffled noises. As the man listened, he suddenly heard his own voice repeating his words back to him in a soft whisper. It was as if someone was recording and then echoing his words back to him. Disturbed, he tried to speak, but was met with more static. At one point, he swore he heard someone breathing heavily through the receiver. And then the distorted voice said, "I see you." The man immediately hung up, but the sensation of being watched lingered for hours. Despite trying to trace the number, he was unable to get any meaningful information from the phone company. The call was traced to a random payphone miles away, leaving the man unsettled and confused about what had happened. In 2006, a woman from New York received a phone call that disturbed her to her core. The call came from her deceased grandmother's phone number. At first, she assumed it was some kind of mistake or a wrong number. However, when she answered, the voice on the other end said, "It's me. I'm okay." The woman froze, as her grandmother had passed away just months earlier. Thinking it was a prank, she hung up, but the same number called back. This time, the voice was softer, almost gentle, and said, "I'm still here. You need to let go." The woman, shaken, contacted her family, and they confirmed that the phone number had not been disconnected. The phone company also couldn't explain why the call had come through. After that, the call stopped, but the woman was left unsettled, unable to rationalize what had happened. In 2012, a mother received a terrifying phone call in the middle of the night. A deep, distorted voice on the other end of the line said, "I have your daughter." Panicked, the woman screamed for her daughter's name but received no response. The caller didn't demand money or provide any details. They simply repeated, "I have her." "What are you going to do about it?" Frantic, the mother immediately hung up and rushed to her daughter's room. To her relief, the daughter was still asleep, unharmed. The calls continued over the next few days, with the caller mentioning specific locations the woman had been, but never leaving any tangible threat. After speaking with the authorities, the woman was advised to block the number and take precautions. The calls eventually stopped, but the woman couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that someone had been watching her family. In 2015, a teenager received a call from a private number that seemed like a wrong number at first. However, the voice on the other end was distorted and raspy, saying, "I see you." The teenager thought it was a prank, so he hung up. But the voice called back, this time with more threatening language, claiming to be watching him through his window. The calls continued for days, with the voice becoming more specific about his movements, mentioning where he went to school, where he hung out, and even the clothes he was wearing. Despite checking his window every time, the teenager never saw anyone. The calls eventually stopped, but the terror of someone knowing his every move stayed with him. A woman in Missouri received a phone call from a strange number in 2009. When she answered, a low, cryptic voice on the other end said, "I know what you did." She asked who it was, but the caller remained silent. The phrase was repeated several times, each time getting more unnerving, as if they were trying to taunt her. The caller gave no context and wouldn't answer any questions. When the woman tried to trace the call, the number came back as a blocked or untraceable number. The calls continued for days, with no explanation, until they abruptly stopped. In 1998, a man received a call from a payphone in Washington. The voice on the other end was gravelly and distorted, saying, "I know you're alone. I'm watching you." The man initially brushed it off as a prank, but the caller knew specific details about his life, his workplace, his daily routines, and even his home address. The calls continued, each one getting more specific about his personal life. After reporting the incident to the police, they were able to trace the calls back to a payphone miles away, but the person responsible was never identified. In 2011, a woman in Arizona received a phone call from what appeared to be a local hospital. The voice on the other end was distorted but clearly said, "I know you're alone. We've been watching you. Don't scream." The woman thought it was a wrong number, but the caller began to make specific threats, talking about places she frequented and mentioning her schedule. Fearing for her safety, she called the police, but the calls continued for several weeks. The police never tracked down the caller, and they eventually stopped. But the woman remained terrified for months. In 2003, a hiker called 911, saying that he was lost in the mountains. The call was placed just as the man became disoriented, stating that he couldn't find his way out. The dispatcher could hear him breathing heavily, and in the background there was a strange growling noise. As he continued to speak, he abruptly started screaming, and the call ended. Authorities launched an immediate search, but no trace of the hiker or the mysterious creature in the background was ever found. In 2014, a frantic 911 call came from a family of 4 who were on a road trip. The father claimed that they were being followed by an unknown vehicle. The family's voices were filled with distress, and they pleaded for help, stating they were getting close to an isolated area. The call abruptly cut off, and authorities were unable to trace their location in time. The family was never found, and their disappearance is still one of the most mysterious unsolved cases in California. At 11:58 p.m., a 911 dispatcher in Nashville received a call from Kari's cell phone. On the recording, the dispatcher's voice is calm but firm. 911, what's your emergency? For a moment, there's nothing, just dead air. Then, a faint sound filters through. Shaky breathing, a soft rustling, like someone shifting or trying to hide. The dispatcher repeats the question, a little louder this time. Hello? Can you hear me? Still no response, but the line stays open. For the next 90 seconds, the dispatcher listens to what sounds like footsteps crunching on gravel, the muted thud of something heavy closing, and, most unsettling, a whisper that's barely audible. Some say it sounds like a name. Others insist it's just static. Then abruptly, the call cuts off. The trace led officers to a remote construction site off Highway 96, about 15 miles from where Kari was last seen. Her car was found parked haphazardly along a dirt path, the driver's side door wide open, engine still warm. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but falling snow. They combed the area, flashlights slicing through the dark, boots crunching through fresh snow. But there was no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away, nothing but silence. It was as if Kari had simply vanished into the night.